Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Mark Rechtin, Executive Editor of S&P Global Mobility. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the transition from an internal combustion world to one of battery electric propulsion, and what that means for the traditional automotive supplier base. If you're a maker of engine, transmission, fuel, or exhaust systems, how do you fit into this picture, and how do you make a business case in such an environment? How existential is this crisis? Is it survivable? Or is your doomed fate inevitable? Joining us today is Michael Robinet, Consulting Executive Director for SP Global Mobility, Mike Wall, Sales Engineering Executive Director, and Mike Southcott, Associate Manager of Propulsion Component Research. Good morning.
Good day.
Good
All right.
morning, good afternoon.
Good morning, Mark.
All right. Let's start with Michael Robinet. Say you're a supplier of throttle bodies or fuel injectors or exhaust manifolds, and you see these relatively small EV market share numbers. You might not think it's a time to act rashly, to pivot dramatically. Sure, EVs are 1 in 4 cars sold in China, but they're only 12% of the EU market and only 6% of the US market. Why panic? This could be just a passing fad, right?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be a passing fad. What many suppliers understand, it is really more when, not if, this is going to occur, and it's just a matter of the pace and the amplitude. To your point, though, certainly the numbers don't look very strong right now, but that's current production, and we got to remember that the industry really works in 3 phases. It works in the development phase, where you develop new products and components and systems for vehicles that are coming out over the next couple of years. You've got obviously vehicles in production right now, which, it's mostly ICE, as you mentioned. And then there's also the aftermarket side. So how are we servicing the vehicles that are in operation, whether they be ICE or BEV? Nonetheless, the development side is already shifted towards BEV, and the supply base is very, very well aware of that.
Okay. So we're going to turn to Mike Southcott, a subject matter on all things powertrain and who is based in London. So, Mike, despite President Biden's recent urging to speed the EV adoption process, it seems like there is a much stronger push for BEV acquisition in Europe, both in terms of EU mandates, but also consumer sentiment. That may be affecting suppliers based on the continent more so than here in the US. Can you point to any examples of sector consolidation already happening in Europe, or of suppliers who may have successfully pivoted already to accommodate the BEV business?
Yeah, so I guess building on what Michael Robinet spoke about, you're in these different phases, and I guess seeing suppliers that are pivoting into different R&D, but there's still a lot of money to be made in ICE-based technology. If we take 2 of the bigger forecasts that we maintain here in S&P Global, of the turbocharger and the fuel injector, looking at the numbers in 2028, there's still around 36 million turbos left required on the market to be produced, and still about 248 million injectors that will be required for new vehicles in 2028. So there's still a lot of money to be made on those technologies. But yes, we are seeing consolidation. It's happened over the last, probably since early to mid 2000s, 2010 onwards. If we take the turbocharger market as a good example, we're really seeing a few suppliers now saying, no, we're not going to develop this new technology anymore. We're not going to bid on any new programs where the volumes just aren't quite enough for them. And we're seeing sort of the bigger 2 or 3 players really pick up that market. And I expect it to consolidate even more and on even more components. In terms of suppliers who are successfully pivoting, they're kind of doing it in a lot of different ways at the minute. We've seen quite a few takeovers. There's also joint ventures. So maybe to touch on a few that not necessarily European-based, more global suppliers. Magna are quite a good example. They've traditionally been on, transmission and driveline components. They've set up 2 good joint ventures with Hasco Magna out of China and LG Magna e-powertrain, and that's predominantly around building up a network of motor technology, inverter technology, system integration, and then another company, again based in the US, who've not done it around mergers, more around acquisitions, is Borg Warner. So the interesting one there was when they acquired Delphi a year or 2 ago, and predominantly that was around bringing that inverter technology that Delphi had underneath that umbrella, so they could offer the system integration, the inverter, and the motor. What we've then seen towards the end of last year is an announcement that they plan on selling off or spinning off their GDI portion and also the aftermarket bit into an offering separate. So they've taken the inverter bit, and then the rest of it they will sort of sell off or spin off while there's still a bit of volume for maybe an investor to come in and make an initial bit of money. And then a last one who I think are quite relevant is Faurecia, so a big exhaust component company here based in Europe. Not to say they didn't enter into the BEV market in terms of propulsion technology, at least. They've got a lot of seating, interior connected. They almost pivoted away from BEV and have gone down the fuel cell route. So looking at things, partnerships with Michelin here in Europe, and forming a stack company called Symbio. So they're another company who are probably the biggest exhaust catalytic converter supplier who are really pivoting their business in a slightly different way.
Okay, thanks. It sounds like a lot of the big players are already starting to sort of turn their big ships in new directions. We're going to turn to Mike Wall, and it's your turn to play devil's advocate or not. In the big picture, EVs are still a relatively small fraction of all cars on the planet. There are 1.3 billion and counting internal combustion cars still on the world's roads, and they're going to need spare parts for decades to come. And there's all these markets that don't have a properly functioning electrical grid that can handle EVs. And that likely means that we're going to be requiring ICE vehicles for quite a while, right?
No, absolutely. I know it can kind of sometimes sound contradictory. We see so much investment in EVs and all of the talk and the whole universe is talking about EVs, but two things can be correct at the same time. There's, on the one hand, there's massive EV deployment in the very near future, and as Michael had mentioned, that investment and development is already ongoing, but yet there also be a very long tail for ICE applications. We see it on the one hand, which you mentioned, the installed base. This aftermarket component is very, very real, and that's going to be around for quite a long time. And then the other point too is when you start looking at some of these emerging markets, their adoption rate, their take rate into EV will look a little different, and it will take maybe a little bit more time. And it may not be as take as long as what maybe people would maybe thinking, especially as you get more and more government involvement in some of these areas, because we're already seeing battery investment in some far-flung reaches and development and deployment there as well. But at the end of the day, we do expect to see some of those ICE applications continuing to extend a little bit further in some of those emerging markets as well.
Okay. So it sounds like, not only in terms of the production line for fresh built cars, but also the spare parts world is going to be pretty secure for a while. But that doesn't mean that every supplier can be included in this. And I'm going to turn back to Michael Robinet here, who wrote this month's Fuel for Thought article, which you all should read, outlining the 4 potential paths to survival for these ICE suppliers. Well, okay, maybe they aren't so much about survival as making the crash landing more of a glide path than a nosedive. So, Michael, why don't you walk us through them?
Well, there's 4 variants, and there's obviously there's combinations of those variants. But the first one is, if you're in the ICE world, you probably need to determine whether you're what we call pretty well 100% OE, or if you've got some sort of, as you mentioned earlier, aftermarket tail. For instance, tire manufacturers, they sell a set of tires to the OEs, but they're obviously banking on you buying their tires when the vehicle's in operation and the first set is finished. The same goes for spark plugs and for belts and hoses and such. But not every component has a long aftermarket tail. Something like a throttle body or a piston, if you need a new one of those, usually you have to your engine is finished. So you get the general idea. It depends on who you are, but nonetheless, there's 4 selections, or at least generally 4 ways that need to be addressed. The first one is you can just decide to evacuate. You might say, you know what, I've looked forward. I don't like where this is going. My economies of scale are going to start to be a little bit more challenged depending on the component that I'm providing. I'm not able to take my current production base and move over to other areas of the market. So that is certainly problematic. I would say the other issue, so you could sell. That would be basically one. One, you could what we call lift and shift. You could take your existing capability and use the cash flow from it, and then move into another area that might be BEV positive. Maybe you've taken your gear production and you've found a way to successfully move into e-motors. So that might be an opportunity. You could double down. You could say, you know what, I'm so good at what I do, and I think Michael Southcott talked about this earlier. I'm so good at what I do, I'm just going to double down by some of my competitors and just ride this out. Um, and then the last one could be a variant of that strategy where you just basically say, you know what, my operations are all sunk cost, and I'm just going to continue to run my business and drive it as efficiently as I can for the next decade or so. And then basically we'll make a decision, 5 or 10 years from now, whenever we have to. So basically, four categories or four areas to address. You could find a partner or an alliance. That could be another opportunity. But basically, it's one of those four choices.
Okay, Michael Robinet, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up here. If you look at sort of the overall supplier base and these four categories, do you see most of them falling into one area or another? And I guess another key question is, do they know this?
I'll be honest with you. Most tier ones, I would expect, know what's going on. They may not know exactly what to do, to be honest, because some of them are private equity owned, some are family run, family company owned, some are privately held, some are publicly held, and everybody's got a different agenda, different shareholder base, and different long-term goals for their organization. So, they may or may not. I would say most of those know. I'm more concerned, and I know Mike Wall probably is the same way, of the tier twos and the tier threes. They don't know what they don't know in some cases. And even though some are clients of ours and we tell them what's going on, a lot of tier twos are also in other parts of industry. They're in industrial, they're in aerospace. So they may not be completely up to date where their components are ending up within automotive. And that may be a little bit of a freight train that's headed down the track that they don't know that it's coming down the track. So it depends on the supplier, depends on their situation, but I would say most suppliers have a pretty good idea this is coming.
Okay, so that dovetails perfectly into the next question. We're going to put this to Mike Wall. Let's look at the flip side of running headlong into supplying BEV growth. Let's say the supplier, they got religion and they're saying, okay, BEV is here. It's here for good. We need to get on this. Well, to borrow the analogy, get on this train. We know that automakers are always bullish about their own sales prospects, and their product is always going to succeed where others will fail, right? But there's always a loser in the sales equation. So what happens to a supplier when this overexuberance doesn't pan out and their OE customer only sells 200,000 of its electric SUV instead of the planned 300,000? These suppliers will suffer the same fate as when internal combustion sales don't pan out, right? I mean, how do you protect yourself as a supplier during this transitional time?
Yeah, I mean that is sort of the $1 million question in all of this, because it is probably one of the biggest risks facing suppliers. And as Michael was kind of alluding to as well, I do think that the issue is even so much more grave when you start talking about the tier two and tier three, because as you go down the pecking order, as it were, that volume or that information communication gets a little bit more jagged, a little bit more fragmented, and you're not working with maybe the same level of information, unless you're working with an outside firm, hopefully, to help you understand all of that. And that's the biggest challenge: is how do you, as a supplier, protect yourself if those volumes don't materialize, or more importantly, maybe when those volumes don't materialize. How I've seen it with different suppliers, being successful in trying to cope with that is, wherever they can, um, staging out their investment, staging out their capex spend, working with their banks. That's going to be another critical factor, is big communication with their banking institution to also convey their own financing needs and when, and also their way of communicating that information then to their upstream customer as well, whether that be a tier one or maybe all the way up to the automaker, to try to get call it more favorable capital deployment schedules. Another big factor that's going to have to be under consideration is how they get reimbursed for tooling and development costs. If it's the old way of just simply amortizing it into piece price, that's a problem, because in some cases you might never see that money back. So you have to be thinking about getting tooling payments up front as much as possible, progress payments, or again, phased in payments as the program progresses. Anything to help defray some of that capital cost and capital spend that directly impacts your financial operations.
All right, some really good words of wisdom here. And so now I'm going to take this theory and put it into practice. I'm going to ask each of you to engage in some lightning round role playing. And we'll start with Mike Southcott because I've sort of put him on the sidelines there for a sec. So we're going to start with him. Let's say you're the CEO of a mid-sized camshaft shop. You're not the biggest dog in the pack, but you're a key supplier to a couple OEMs. What's your next move?
Yeah, the $1 million question. I guess my advice, what I would do, I think initially you have to play within your comfort zone. When I say that, you've got camshaft, so where in an electric vehicle, where in a fuel cell vehicle looking further down the line, where in a hybrid, obviously in a hybrid it's obvious for camshafts, but where are shafts still required? They're still required in an electric vehicle through the motor, through different parts. So play within your comfort zone, begin investing some money and some R&D into the different ways in which you can pivot your production lines, pivot your knowledge base, but staying in that comfort zone initially. And I guess the other bit is to keep that relationship going with those OEMs as they go through the transition into an electric vehicle world. Then they're still going to need that supply chain. If you've got that relationship and you've supported them all the way through this transition with camshafts, then you know, not to say you're definitely going to get more business, but if you've got the production lines, there's a good chance that you can keep that relationship going.
Okay, so we have a pretty good relationship with the OEM, which we all know that suppliers and OEMs get along so great. We know that. Let's switch to Michael Robinet, and I put camshaft shop out there as one example, but it seems like there is a bit of a transition that you could make to BEV. Let's look at something that really has no version of BEV, and that's an exhaust system. Let's say you're an exhaust supplier. What do you do?
Well, you probably have not too many choices. You take a look at your current slate of programs, how long they're going to last, what the positive, negative, and maybe base scenario would be of what your volumes are going to be. Take a look at your plant loading and try to time when you're going to have to start to consolidate. Your production to try and keep your economies of scale and your utilization as strong as possible. If you've just realized that you're an exhaust supplier and then there's no future for you, to an earlier point, I doubt there's going to be a lot of opportunity for you to take what capital you have left and find something else to do in the BEV world. That boat is probably floated. So you really need to kind of control it down. Maybe you go to an OEM and you say, hey, listen, this is impacting all of us. Why don't you consolidate more and more of your needs with me? And I'll handle your aftermarket requirements, from a service perspective. So there are a lot of options. None of them are, to be honest with you, that enticing. But at this point, it's sort of controlling the decline or deciding to get out and let somebody else do it.
Okay, Mike Wall, you are the CEO. You're sitting in front of your board of directors, and they're giving you the hard stare of, all right, what are we going to do? We're not the biggest, we're not the smallest. Do we bail out and just cut our losses and find a way to gracefully exit this scene, or do we try and take over all the other mid-sized suppliers? What do you say?
Well, I mean, you kind of framed it up well. I mean, sometimes that is the hardest thing to say is we're gonna pull the ripcord and and jump. But in some cases, that may very well have to be the case. We're exiting. I think it's been well covered, but between Mike Southcott and Michael both, yeah, I think that you have to have some self-reflection. You have to really assess, where do you really sit within the supply chain. really assess your strengths and weaknesses on that front, and making those hard decisions. It may very well be that you're not in it for the long haul. If it's a family-owned operation, particularly as you start talking about these tier 2 and tier 3 companies, they may be family organizations. Does that second or third gen family representative really want to be in this business for the longer period? If yes, then you go back to the basics of, again, where do we fit? Or do we have the ability to consolidate, be a consolidator within that industry? If not, there's nothing wrong with taking the cash, if you will, and living to fight another day and find another investment. But those are the kind of critical decisions that I think a wide variety of suppliers are going to be facing over these next several years.
All right. Well, obviously, we have just scratched the surface of this issue, and we could probably delve into many more of the issues confronting these OEMs and their suppliers, but our time is up. Thank you to the Michaels and Mikes for joining us today, and thanks to you for listening. That was a lot to unpack, but I hope you all feel smarter and more informed for having tuned in. And if so, please share this podcast link with your colleagues and social media accounts. And to opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, please visit spglobal.com/mobility. We'll be back with more fuel for thought next month.